Hello. Before we begin, a quick note. The Boy to Sleep podcast relies on you and sponsors, which means you will hear a quick advertisement before the beginning of tonight's episode. While the podcast is free, you are welcome to subscribe for just $2.99 per month, which supports the creation of this podcast and gives you an ad-free listening experience. Simply click the link in the show notes from your podcast app. Rest easy. Hello. Welcome to the Bore You to Sleep podcast, the podcast that will hopefully help you get to sleep. I am going to read an open source book, one that is not particularly interesting, but one that is hopefully boring enough to get you to sleep. Tonight's reading comes from The History of Psychoanalytic Movement, written by Sigmund Freud and published in 1917. This book presents the views of Sigmund Freud. Often controversial, Freud is widely considered the founder of psychoanalysis. My name is Teddy, and I aim to help people everywhere get a good night's rest. Sleep is so important, and my mission is to help you get the rest you need. The podcast is designed to play in the background while you slowly fall asleep. For those of you who are new to the podcast, you may not know that it started from my own struggles with sleep. I wanted to create a resource for others facing similar challenges, and I'm so grateful for the amazing community we've built together. This podcast is self-made and self-produced, which is why you'll hear a short ad at the beginning of each episode. These ads, along with support from subscribers and patrons on Patreon, enable me to keep delivering this podcast for free to those who need it. Thank you to everyone who shared their words of gratitude with me during the week, whether through the website or the podcast app. Your messages mean the world to me. As I've mentioned before, my goal is to keep this podcast free and accessible to everyone. If you find the podcast beneficial and would like to support it, here are a few ways you can contribute. Follow the podcast in your podcast app and leave a comment. You can also become a subscriber for $2.99 per month by clicking on the link in the show notes. This supports episode creation and creates for an ad-free listening experience. If subscribing is not possible, and I completely understand if it is not, an easy way to help is simply by leaving a review and rating in your podcast app. Even one sentence really helps out. If you ever want to say hello to me, you can visit me at boytosleep.com. From there, you can always leave a message. If you know someone who is also needing a good night's rest, you're always welcome to share this episode or this podcast with them. In the meantime, lie back, relax, and enjoy the readings. The History of Psychoanalytic Movement by Professor Dr. Sigmund Freud of Vienna. Chapter 1. If in what follows I bring any contribution to the history of the psychoanalytic movement, nobody must be surprised at the subjective nature of this paper, nor at the role which falls to me therein. For psychoanalysis is my creation. For 10 years I was the only one occupied with it, and all the annoyance which this new subject caused among my contemporaries has been hurled upon my head in the form of criticism. Even today, when I am no longer the only psychoanalyst, I feel myself justified in assuming that none can know better than myself what psychoanalysis is, wherein it differs from the other methods of investigating the psychic life, what its name should cover, or what might better be designated as something else. In the year 1909, when I was first privileged to speak publicly on psychoanalysis in an American university, fired by this momentous occasion for my endeavours, I declared that it was not myself who brought psychoanalysis into existence. I said that it was Joseph Breuer, who had merited this honour at a time when I was a student and busy working for my examinations in 1880 to 1882. Since then, well-intentioned friends have frequently repeated that I then expressed my gratitude out of all due proportion. They considered that, as on previous occasions, I should have dignified Breuer's cathartic procedure as merely preliminary to psychoanalysis, and should have claimed that psychoanalysis itself only began with my rejection of the hypnotic technique and my introduction of free association. Now it is really a matter of indifference whether the history of psychoanalysis be considered to have started with the cathartic method, or only with my modification of the same. I only enter into this uninteresting question because some opponents of psychoanalysis are wont to recall, now and then, that the art of psychoanalysis did not originate with me at all, but with Breuer. Naturally, this only happens to be the case when their attitude permits them to find in psychoanalysis something that is noteworthy. On the other hand, when their repudiation of psychoanalysis is unlimited, then psychoanalysis is always indisputably my creation. I have never yet heard that Breuer's great part in psychoanalysis has brought him an equal measure of insults and reproach, as I have recognized long since that it is the inevitable fate of psychoanalysis to arouse opposition and to embitter people. I have come to the conclusion that I must surely be the originator of all that characterizes psychoanalysis. I add, with satisfaction, that none of the attempts to belittle my share in this much disdained psychoanalysis has ever come from Breuer himself, or could boast of his support. The content of Breuer's discovery has been so often presented that a detailed discussion of it here may be omitted. Its fundamental fact is that the symptoms of hysterical patients depend upon impressive but forgotten scenes in their lives. The therapy founded thereon was to cause the patients to recall and reproduce these experiences under hypnosis, and the fragmentary theory deduced from it was that these symptoms corresponded to an abnormal use of an undischarged sums of excitement. In this theoretical contribution to the studies of hysteria, Breuer, wherever obliged to mention conversion, has always added my name in parentheses, as though his first attempt at a theoretical formulation was my mental property. I think this allotment refers only to the nomenclature, whilst the conception itself occurred to us both at the same time. It is also well known that Breuer, after his first experience with it, allowed the cathartic treatment to rest for a number of years, and only resumed it after I caused him to do so, on my return from Charcot. He was then an internist and taken up with a rather busy medical practice. I had become a physician quite reluctantly but had at the time received a strong motive for desiring to help nervous patients, or at least to learn to understand something of their conditions. I had placed reliance on physical therapy and found myself helpless in the face of disappointments that came to me with W. Erb's electrotherapy, so rich in advice and indications. If I did not, at the time, pilot myself independently to the opinion later announced by Mobius, that the successes of electrotherapy in nervous disorders are the results of suggestion, it was surely only the absence of these successes that was to blame. The treatment by suggestion in deep hypnosis seemed to offer me at the time sufficient compensation for the lost electrical therapy. I learned this treatment through the extremely impressive demonstrations of Labolt and Bernheim. But the investigation under hypnosis with which I became acquainted through Brewer, I found, owing to its automatic manner of working and the simultaneous gratification of one's eagerness for knowledge, much more attractive than the monotonous and violent suggestive command, which was devoid of every possibility of inquiry. As one of the latest achievements of psychoanalysis, we have lately been admonished to put the actual conflict and the cause of the illness into the foreground of analysis. This is exactly what Brewer and I did in the beginning of our work with the cathartic method. We guided the patient's attention directly to the traumatic scene during which the symptom had arisen, tried to find therein the psychic conflict and to free the repressed effect. We thus discovered the procedure characteristic of the psychic processes of the neuroses, which I later named regression. The associations of the patients went back from the scene to be explained to earlier experiences, and this forced the analysis which was to correct the present to occupy itself with the past. This regression led even further backwards. At first it went quite regularly to the time of puberty. Later, however, such failures as gaps in the understanding tempted the analytic work further back into the years of childhood, which had, hitherto, been inaccessible to every sort of investigation. This regressive direction became an important characteristic of the analysis. It was proved that psychoanalysis could not clear up anything actual, except by going back to something in the past. It even proved that every pathological experience presupposes an earlier one which, though not in itself pathological, lent a pathological quality to the later occurrence. But the temptation to stop short at the known actual cause was so great that even in later analysis I yielded to it. In the case of the patient called Dora, carried out in 1899, the scene which caused the outbreak of the actual illness was known to me. I tried uncounted times to analyze this experience, but all that I could receive to my direct demands was the same scanty and broken description. Only after a long detour, which led through the earliest childhood of the patient, a dream appeared in the analysis of which the hitherto forgotten details of the scene were remembered, and this made possible the understanding and solution of the actual conflict. From this one example, it may be seen how misleading is the above-mentioned admonition, and how much of a scientific regression it is to follow the advice of neglecting the regression in the analytic technique. The first difference of opinion between Brewer and myself came to light on a question of the more intimate psychic mechanism of hysteria. He still favoured a physiological theory, so to speak, and wished to explain the psychic splitting of consciousness of hysterical subjects by the means of the non-communication of various psychic states, or states of consciousness, as we then called them. He thus created the theory of the hypnoid states, the results of which were supposed to bring the unassimilated foreign body into the waking consciousness. I had formulated this to myself less scientifically. I suspected everywhere tendencies and strivings analogous to those of everyday life, and conceived the psychic splitting itself as a result of a repelling process, which I then called defense and later aggression. I made a short-lived attempt to reconcile both mechanisms, but as experience showed me always the same and only one thing, my defense theory, I soon became opposed to Brewer's theory of hypnoid states. I am, however, quite certain that this difference of opinion had nothing to do with the parting of the ways which occurred soon afterward between us. The latter had a deeper reason, but it happened in such a manner that at first I did not understand it, and only later did I learn to interpret it, following many good indexes. Whoever will reread the history of Brewer's patient in the light of the experience gained in the last 20 years will have no difficulty in understanding the symbolism of the snakes and of the arm, by taking into account also the situation at the sickbed of the father. He will easily guess the actual meaning of that symptom formation. To cure the patient, Brewer utilized the most intensive suggestive rapport, which may serve us as prototype of which we will call transference. One day, while I was a young hospital doctor, I was accompanying Brewer on a walk through the town when a man came up to him urgently, desiring to speak with him. I fell back, and when Brewer was free again, he told me, in his kindly, teacher-like manner, that this was the husband of a patient, who had brought him some news about her. The wife, he added, behaved in so conspicuous a manner when in company, that she had been turned over to him for treatment as a nervous case. He ended with the remark, "Those are always secrets of the alcove." Astonished, I asked him his meaning, and he explained the expression to me, "secrets of the conjugal bed," without realizing how preposterous the matter appeared to me. A few years later, at one of Charcot's evening receptions, I found myself near the venerated teacher, who was just relating to Bruderl a very interesting history from the day's practice. I did not hear the beginning clearly, but gradually the story obtained my attention. A year later, when I had begun my medical activities in Vienna in nervous diseases, I was as innocent and ignorant in all that concerned the etiology of the neuroses as any promising academician could be expected to be. One day, I received a friendly call from the Chobrak, who asked me to take a patient to whom he could not give sufficient time to his capacity as lecturer at the university. I reached the patient before he did, and learned that she suffered from senseless attacks of anxiety, which could only be alleviated by the most exact information as to the whereabouts of her physician at any time in the day. Beginning with the year 1902, a number of young doctors crowded about me with the expressed intention to learn psychoanalysis, to practice it and to spread it. The impetus for this came from a colleague who had himself experienced the beneficial effects of the analytic therapy. We met on certain evenings at my residence and discussed subjects according to certain rules. The visitors endeavoured to orient themselves in this strange and new realm of investigation, and to interest others in the matter. One day, a young graduate of the technical school found admission to our circle by means of a manuscript, which showed extraordinary sense. We induced him to go through college and enter the university, and then devote himself to the non-medical application of psychoanalysis. Thus the little society gained a zealous and reliable secretary, and I acquired in Otto rank a most faithful helper and collaborator. Soon the little circle expanded, and in the course of the next few years changed a good deal in its composition. On the whole, I could flatter myself that in the wealth and variety of talent our circle was hardly inferior to the staff of any clinical teacher. From the very beginning, it included those men who later were to play a considerable, if not always delectable, part in the history of the psychoanalytic movement. But these developments could not have been guessed at that time. I was satisfied, and I believe I did all I could to convey to the others what I knew and had experienced. There were only two inauspicious circumstances which at least mentally estranged me from this circle. I could not succeed in establishing among the members that friendly relation which should obtain men doing the same difficult work, nor could I crush out the quarrels about the priority of discoveries, for which there were ample opportunities in those conditions of working together. The difficulties of teaching the practice of psychoanalysis, which are particularly great, and are often to blame for the present rejection of psychoanalysis, already made themselves felt in this Viennese private psychoanalytic society. I myself did not dare to present an as yet incomplete technique, and a theory still in the making, with that authority which might have spared the others many a blind alley, and many a final tripping up. The self-dependence of mental workers, their early independence of the teacher, is always gratifying psychologically, but it can only result in a scientific gain when during these labours certain, not too frequently occurring, personal relations are also fulfilled. Psychoanalysis particularly should have required a long and severe discipline and training of self-control. On account of the courage displayed in devotion to so ridiculed and fruitless a subject, I was inclined to tolerate among the members much to which otherwise I would have objected. Besides, the circle included not only physicians, but other cultured men who had recognized something significant in psychoanalysis. There were authors, artists, and so forth. The interpretation of dreams, the book on wit, and other writings had already shown that the principles of psychoanalysis cannot remain limited to the medical field, but are capable of application to various other mental sciences. In 1907, the situation suddenly altered, and quite contrary to all expectations. It became evident that psychoanalysis had unobtrusively awakened some interest and gained some friends, that there were even some scientific workers who were prepared to admit their allegiance. A communication from Bleuler had already acquainted me with the fact that my works were studied and applied in Bergolzi. In January 1907, the first man attached to the Zurich clinic, Dr. Eatington, visited me at Vienna. Other visitors soon followed, thus causing a lively exchange of ideas. Finally, by invitation of C.G. Jung, then still an assistant physician at Bergholzi. The first meeting took place at Salzburg in the spring of 1908, where the friends of psychoanalysis from Vienna, Zurich, and other places met together. The result of this first psychoanalytic congress was the founding of a periodical, which began to appear in 1909. I have repeatedly and gratefully acknowledged the efforts of the Zurich Psychiatric School in the spreading of psychoanalysis, especially those of Bleuler and Jung, and I do not hesitate to do the same today, even under such changed circumstances. It was certainly not the partisanship of the Zurich School which at the time first directed the attention of the scientific world to the subject of psychoanalysis. This latency period had just come to an end, and psychoanalysis everywhere became the object of constantly increasing interest. But whilst in all the other places this manifestation of interest resulted first in nothing but a violent and emphatic repudiation of the subject in Zurich, on the contrary, the main feeling of the situation was that of agreement. In no other place was so compact a little gathering of adherents to be found. Nowhere also was it possible to place a public clinic at the service of psychoanalytic investigation, or to find a clinical teacher who regarded the principles of psychoanalysis as an integral part of the teaching of psychiatry. The Zurich doctors became, as it were, the nucleus of the little band which was fighting for the recognition of psychoanalysis. Only in Zurich was there a possible opportunity to learn the new art and to apply it in practice. Most of my present-day followers and co-workers came to me via Zurich, even those who might have found, geographically speaking, a shorter road to Vienna than to Switzerland. Vienna lies in an eccentric position from Western Europe, which houses the great centres of our culture. For many years it has been much affected by weighty prejudices. The representatives of the most prominent nations stream into Switzerland, which is so mentally active, and an infective lesion in this place was sure to become very important for the dissemination of the psychic epidemic, as Hoche of Freudberg called it. According to the testimony of a colleague who was an eyewitness of the developments of Bergholzi, it may be asserted that psychoanalysis wakened an interest there very early. Already in Jung's work on occult phenomena, published in 1902, there was an allusion to dream interpretation. Ever since 1903 or 1904, according to my informer, psychoanalysis came into prominence. After the establishment of personal relations between Vienna and Zurich, a society was also founded in Bergholzi in 1907, which discussed the problems of psychoanalysis at regular meetings. In the bond that united the Vienna and Zurich schools, the Swiss were by no means the merely recipient part. They had themselves already performed respectable scientific work, the results of which were of much use to psychoanalysis. The association experiment started by the Wundt school had been interpreted by them in the psychoanalytic sense and had proved itself of unexpected usefulness. Thus it had become possible to get rapid experimental confirmation of psychoanalytic facts, and to demonstrate experimentally to beginners certain relationships which the analyst could only have talked about otherwise. The first bridge leading from experimental psychology to psychoanalysis had thus been constructed. In psychoanalytic treatment, however, the association experiment enables one to make only a preliminary, qualitative analysis of the case. It offers no essential contribution to the technique, and is really not indispensable in the work of analysis. Of more importance, however, was another discovery of the Zurich school, or rather of its two leaders, Bleuler and Jung. The former pointed out that a great many purely psychiatric cases can be explained by the same psychoanalytic process as those used in dreams and in the neuroses. Jung employed with success the analytic method of interpretation in the strangest and most obscure phenomena of dementia, the origin of which appeared quite clear when correlated with the life interests of the patient. From that time on, it became impossible for the psychiatrist to ignore psychoanalysis. Bleuler's great work on schizophrenia in 1911, in which the psychoanalytic points of view are placed on an equal footing with the clinical systematic ones, brought this success to completion. I must not omit to point out a divergence which was then already distinctly noticeable in the working tendencies of the two schools. Already in 1897, I had published the analysis of a case of schizophrenia, which showed, however, paranoid trends, so that its solution could not have anticipated the impression of Jung's analyses. But to me the important element had not been the interpretation of the symptoms, but rather the psychic mechanisms of the disease, and above all, the agreement of this mechanism with the one already known in hysteria. No light had been thrown at the time on the difference between these two maladies. I was then already working toward a theory of the libido in the neuroses, which was to explain all neurotic as well as psychotic appearances on the basis of abnormal drifts of the libido. The Swiss investigators lacked this point of view. So far as I know, Bleuler, even today, adheres to an organic causation for the forms of dementia, and Jung, whose book on this malady appeared in 1907, upheld the toxic theory of the same at the time Congress at Salzburg in 1908, which, though not excluding it, goes far beyond the libido theory. On this same point he came to grief later, 1912, and that he now used too much on the stuff which previously he refused to employ at all. A third contribution from the Swiss school, which is to be ascribed probably entirely to Jung, I do not value as highly as do others who are not in as close contact with it. I speak of the theory of the complexes, which grew out of the Diagnostic Association, 1906 to 1910. It itself has neither resulted in a psychological theory, nor has it landed an unconstrained insertion to the context of the psychoanalytic principles. On the other hand, the word complex has gained for itself the right of citizenship in psychoanalysis, as being a convenient and often an indispensable term for descriptive summaries of psychologic facts. None other among the names and designations, newly coined as a result of psychoanalytic needs, has attained such widespread popularity, but no other term has been so misapplied to the detriment of clear thinking. In psychoanalytic diction, one often spoke of the return of the complex, when the return of the repression was intended to be conveyed, or one became accustomed to say, "I have a complex against him," when more correctly he should have said, "a resistance." In the years after 1907, which followed the union of the schools of Vienna and Zurich, psychoanalysis received that extraordinary impetus in which it still finds itself today. This is positively attested by the spread of psychoanalytic literature and the increase in the number of doctors who desire to practice or learn it, who by the mass of attacks upon it by Congress and learned societies. It has wandered into the most distant countries. It everywhere shocked psychiatrists and has gained the attention of the cultured laity and workers in other scientific fields. Havelock Ellis, who has followed its development with sympathy, without ever calling himself its adherent, wrote in 1911, in a paper for the Australasian Medical Congress, "Freud's psychoanalysis is now championed and carried out not only in Austria and in Switzerland, but in the United States, in England, India, Canada, and I doubt not in Australasia." The introduction of psychoanalysis into North America took place under particularly glorious auspices. In the autumn of 1909, Jung and myself were invited by President Stanley Hall of Clark University to take part in the celebration of the 20th anniversary of the opening of Clark University by giving some lectures in German. We found to our great astonishment that the unprejudiced men of that small but respected university knew all the psychoanalytic writings and had honored them in their lectures to their students. And that concludes tonight's readings. If you're not quite tired yet, you're always welcome to listen to another episode of the Bore You to Sleep podcast. Until next time, good night.